There are moments when you walk into a very familiar room, your home, your office, a cafe you've sat in many times before, and yet today it feels different. Not because the furniture has changed, not because the light is gone, but because you enter with a different rhythm. The room stands still, while you arrive carrying too much. The noise isn't necessarily outside. It's in your chest, behind your forehead, in the way you lower yourself into a chair, but never fully sit. There are afternoons when sunlight slants through the window, drawing long lines across the floor, and somehow your inner world feels darker than usual. You pause for a moment, watching dust drift through the light, and it dawns on you. You've moved through the entire day without ever truly stopping, not stopping work, but stopping inside. There is space around you, yet no space within you. We live in rooms designed to hold furniture, not fatigue. And so fatigue follows us home, sits down on the couch, leans against the wall, hangs quietly in the air. We learn how to organize our homes, but rarely how to reorganize our inner lives. We get used to believing that if we just change our circumstances, change locations, change pace, change routines, the heaviness will lift. But often, what needs to change isn't the room, but how we are standing within it. There is a very small moment. You open the door, step inside, and don't turn on the light right away. The remaining daylight is still enough to make out shapes. You stand there for a few seconds in the dimness, not because you're saving electricity, but because your body needs a transition. In those few seconds, nothing is required of you. No one calls your name. It's just you and the space receiving you. A quiet sense of safety appears, not because everything is okay, but because you don't have to do anything yet. You are my refuge in weary days. Psalm-inspired. That line doesn't arrive as an idea. It arrives as a sensation. Your back against a cool wall, your feet on the floor, your body realizing it doesn't have to keep moving forward right now. God's protection often doesn't come by changing the outer world. It comes by changing how the world touches you. The space remains the same, the desk, the chair, the window facing the same direction, but you are no longer exposed to every demand. There is a small distance between you and what presses in. That distance isn't large, but it's enough. There are rooms so quiet, you can hear the clock ticking. At first, that silence makes you uncomfortable. When nothing covers the noise, your thoughts start speaking louder. But if you stay long enough, silence stops feeling like an empty threat. It becomes a shelter. In that place, you don't have to react. You don't have to explain. You don't have to prove anything. Let not your heart be troubled. Jesus' words remembered. Not a demand to calm down immediately, but an invitation to stay long enough for your heart to stop being pulled in every direction. We often assume peace comes only after everything has been put in order. But there is another kind of peace, one that arrives right in the middle of disorder, when you are held steady enough not to be swept away by it. Like a house standing firm in strong wind. The wind doesn't stop, but the walls remain. There's a very ordinary image. Someone sitting on a long bench in a hallway, waiting for their turn. A public space, harsh lights, footsteps passing by. Nothing about it feels sacred. And yet, while waiting, that person places their hands on their legs, leans back, and exhales, not to ask for anything, just to be there. In that moment, the hallway stops being a temporary place to endure. It becomes a place to stand, and sometimes that is enough to keep you from collapsing. My grace is sufficient for this moment. Paul's words remembered. Sufficient, not for a future that's already clear, but for the space that is unfolding right now. When you begin to realize you are being held, you stop turning every place into a battleground. Home is no longer just a recovery station, so you can brace yourself again tomorrow. Work is no longer only a place to prove your worth. Even in between spaces, parking lots, corridors, waiting areas can become places where you set things down, not because they are beautiful, but because you are no longer standing there alone. Maybe you're in a space you know well, and yet it feels unfamiliar. Maybe you've tried rearranging the outside, but the heaviness remains. Perhaps what you're being invited into isn't leaving for somewhere else, but standing differently, trusting that you are not the sole support, holding the weight of today. Pay attention for a moment. Is there a place in your daily life, a corner of a room, a chair, the doorway, where you could pause without explaining yourself? If you allowed yourself to stay there just a little longer, what would soften first? We're not at the end of the journey. This is only the beginning. Recognizing that the spaces around us can become shelter, not because they change, but because we are no longer standing in them alone. From here, the movement deepens, from being held in space to being reshaped in how we move through life. As you stay long enough in these familiar spaces, something subtle begins to happen. Not because circumstances suddenly ease, not because responsibility disappears, but because the way you inhabit the space changes. You no longer hover at the edges, ready to react. You begin to set your weight down, into the floor, into the chair, into this moment. There are staircases you've walked 1,000 times without noticing, worn steps in the center, a cool handrail, light slanting across the wall. One evening, you stop midway, not because your legs are tired, but because your heart is. No one else is there. Nothing needs to be decided. You place your hand on the rail and breathe out. Just one breath. And in that breath, there's a sense of being held, as if this space doesn't ask you to be stronger, only present. God's protection often works like that, not by pulling you out of every tension, but by giving you a firm ground to stand on. While tension remains, you don't have to leave to be safe. You are safe enough to stay in quietness and trust. You are made steady. Isaiah inspired, not the quiet of escape, but the quiet deep enough that fear no longer steers your direction. As this settles in, you notice a small but important shift. You stop turning every place into a test. The kitchen no longer has to be used efficiently. The office no longer has to justify your existence. Even the bedroom is no longer just a charging station, so you can push again tomorrow. These places become spaces where you are allowed to be someone living, not someone carrying a load. There is a morning with light rain. Gray light spreads evenly across the room. You sit by the window with nothing in your hands. The rain falls steadily, unhurried, and you realize the world keeps moving, even when you don't push it. In that moment, blessing doesn't arrive loudly. It arrives as alignment, your heartbeat slowing, syncing with the rain. You didn't earn it. You simply stayed. Living under this kind of protection doesn't make you passive. It makes you precise. When fear no longer drives you, you choose what's necessary instead of what's loud. You set boundaries Without defensiveness, you leave a space at the right time, not because you're giving up, but because you know you've done enough for today. You might notice this in very small decisions. Standing up 5 minutes earlier, opening a window instead of adding another task, sitting down before responding. These choices don't draw attention, but they accumulate into a life quietly guarded from the inside. And then blessing begins to show itself gently. You sleep more deeply, even with unfinished lists. You enter difficult rooms without shrinking. You listen without armor. This blessing isn't dramatic, but it lasts. It doesn't come because you controlled better, but because you trusted enough to set yourself down. Ask yourself, without rushing an answer, in the spaces you move through every day, where are you still standing without resting? If you allowed yourself to place even a small part down, your shoulders, your jaw, your breath, what would soften first? We are moving deeper along the same path, from recognizing that space can shelter you to letting that shelter shape how you choose, how you remain, how you love. There is one more layer waiting, where blessing becomes not just a sense of safety, but a direction for living. And then one day, you step into that same room, the space that has witnessed so many of your tired moments, and realize you're no longer standing the way you used to. Not because everything has been resolved, not because life has suddenly become light, but because you've learned how to place yourself down in that space. Without defense, you no longer move through rooms with raised shoulders, clenched jaw, a mind always on guard. You are there with your full weight, and it is no longer frightening. When God's protection settles deeply, it begins to do something different. It doesn't just give you a sense of safety, it reshapes how you enter the world. You walk into meetings with a straight back, but not a rigid one. You come home with your keys in hand, without carrying the entire day on your shoulders. You sit in your familiar chair and realize you don't have to earn rest. There are in-between spaces you once rushed through, narrow walkways, steps, long corridors. Now they become breaths between breaths. You pause, not because something needs deciding, but because nothing does. And right there, blessing appears quietly. You are no longer driven by your own urgency. This blessing doesn't mean every room becomes easy. Some spaces remain hard, places filled with heavy memories, places that awaken old tension. But the difference is this: you no longer enter them alone. The space doesn't change, but your relationship to it does. You stand in difficult rooms without shrinking, because you know you are being held. Living this way, you begin to recognize what you need to carry and what you can set down. You stop trying to make every place productive. You allow a room to simply be a room, an evening to simply be an evening, a moment to simply be a moment. And in that permission, life becomes more honest, not because there's less to do, but because there's less resistance. You may notice this in small shifts: choosing a seat closer to the window, letting natural light linger longer, turning off the lights earlier. These gestures don't look spiritual in a dramatic way, but they signal an inner life being reordered from the inside out. Eventually, even your questions change. You used to ask, "How do I get through this?" Now you ask, "How can I be here without losing myself?" That question doesn't push. It opens, and the path it opens leads to a life built, not on gripping tightly, but on being supported. If there's one gentle thing to carry into this week, let it be this. Choose one very specific space, a corner of a room, a chair, a doorway, and decide that this will be where you set things down each day, even for a few minutes, not to escape, not to fix anything, just to be there and let the protection already present do its quiet work. And now, if you're willing, let these words slow into a prayer, not as a new ritual, but as a response to what has been given throughout this journey. God of refuge, in familiar rooms and wind-filled days, teach me how to set myself down without fear. Help me remember that I never stand alone in any space I enter. When I am tense, teach me to release. When I rush, teach me to pause. When I forget that I am being held, remind me through your quiet presence. May the places I pass through each day become places where I learn to trust, so that I may live, not by control, but by rest, not by striving, but by being upheld. And this week, help me remember to stop once each day in a very small space and set down what I no longer need to carry. Amen.